Thanks very much for coming to this presentation. As usual, my talk is going to be about loot boxes inside video games. I know I've spoken at quite a few of the previous Chinese CDiGRA conferences on the same topic. However, I hope you can see that these works do build upon each other in order for us to develop a better understanding of loot boxes, and particularly in a Chinese context. So to start with, a brief introduction to loot boxes. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a screenshot showing what a loot box looks like in one of the more popular games today. On the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that this game informs the player that the probability of obtaining a legendary item, which is the sort of item that most players will be looking for, is only 7.4%. This means that on average, a player needs to purchase more than 10 loot boxes in order to obtain a legendary item. Now, this is how loot boxes differ from other products that you can purchase inside video games. With loot boxes, you do not know what you will get until you've spent money and opened the loot box. Now, these mechanics are conceptually and structurally similar to gambling because the player is investing money into a randomized process to obtain rewards that could be desirable or could alternatively be very disappointing. Importantly, loot box purchasing has been positively correlated with problem gambling. I will delve a bit deeper into that relationship later on, but it's good to remember that as one of the headlines. And finally, this mechanic has been very controversial, and the regulators and policymakers in many countries have considered whether or not to regulate them. Now I'll just show you what it looks like to open a loot box in this particular game. I'll ask you to take note of the audio and visual effects. Now, this is a very disappointing loot box opening result. This is the worst things that you can possibly get. Any player opening this particular loot box will be very disappointed and be eager to move on to the next loot box. So let's do just that. Again, I'm going to ask you to take note of the visual and audio effects. Now this, instead, is a loot box where a legendary item has been opened. You'll recall from earlier that such an item only appears in your loot box 7.4% of the time. So whoever opens this loot box will be very happy indeed. Now, loot boxes are very prevalent in video games today. In China, we found that in mid-2020, 91% of the 100 highest grossing games had loot boxes in them. Now, let's get back to that relationship between loot box purchasing and problem gambling. Now, this was found originally by Zendo and Karens back in 2018, that the more severe a participant's problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes on average. Quite interestingly, even though there is that very robust relationship between loot box purchasing and problem gambling, we do not know whether loot boxes are causing harm in practice. Now, there's a very mixed literature on whether or not loot box spending is linked to psychological distress. You have one paper published by Drummond et al. That found that loot boxes appear to be disproportionately purchased by psychologically distressed and vulnerable people. However, Etros et al. Said that no association between loot box spending and either mental well-being or psychological distress could be found. We attempted to replicate the correlation between loot box spending and problem gambling in China back in 2021. This is because all of the previous research were looking at Western players, so we don't know whether it will be the same in China. Our conclusion at that point was that there appears to be a weaker relationship between gambling and loot boxes in China than in Western countries. We actually did not get enough data to actually conclude whether or not there was a correlation between loot box spending and problem gambling severity. And we only found very weak links between loot box spending and passive gambling participation, and between loot box spending and impulsiveness. One big issue with our previous study was that we did not recruit enough people who participated in gambling, so we didn't have enough people completing the problem gambling severity scale. We sought to address that issue through another replication this year. We recruited 2,601 participants. So this time we have a really big sample. Every participant was asked to complete the problem gambling assessment scale, regardless of whether or not they participated in traditional gambling. This was a change from how we did the study last time. So this means that we had 2,601 people completing that scale and being able to give us data on that particular point. We also assessed problem video gaming, sensation seeking, and risky loot box use. And we added in mental health measures, which are mental well-being and psychological distress, as have been used by the Western literature previously. And this time, the replication was successful. We found that loot box spending was indeed positively correlated with problem gambling severity. We did find that loot box spending was positively correlated with problem video gaming, and that it was positively correlated with risky loot box use. The risky loot box index was something that we translated into Chinese from English for the first time. There are still improvements that could be made if others are interested in researching this area. You'll see that this is the translation that we did for the risky loot box index. Maybe you have to pause to read it, but here is the a screenshot anyway. However, as to other risk factors for gambling, we found results that did not appear to be very helpful in helping us to identify which participant might be experiencing problems with loot boxes. Impulsivity, sensation seeking, and binary passive gambling participation did not positively correlate with loot box spending at a strength that we would have deemed as strong enough. As to mental health, we actually got quite surprising results. We actually found that loot box spending was weakly positively correlated with mental well-being, and that psychological distress and impulsivity both negatively predicted loot box spending. This is quite contrary to what we expect if we think loot boxes are harmful to many people. So I think this really challenges the idea whether loot boxes are harmful to absolutely everyone in all situations. The conclusion is simply that we do not actually know whether people purchasing loot boxes are experiencing harm. Now, loot boxes do share many similarities with gambling, but they do not necessarily share all of the same risk and protective factors. So previous research is, of course, helpful for us to develop a better understanding of loot boxes. However, when researching loot boxes, we do need to recognize that it is a new product that is different from traditional gambling. And so if there are any differences, we need to explore those and we need to understand them better so that we can help anyone who may indeed be experiencing problems with loot boxes. We cannot just copy the gambling literature and pretend that it applies in all cases. Our paper has since been published in Addictive Behaviors, and I've shared the link on the title page for the presentation. You're more than welcome to read more about it there. Thanks very much. If you've got any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer, and please feel free to get in touch with me. Thanks very much.